Welcome back, dear friends. Before we begin, let me know where in the world you are watching. And please don't forget to subscribe and like to support the channel. Right now, somewhere in the world, someone is setting their alarm for 5 in the morning. They're committed this time. Really committed. They'll wake up, go to the gym, meditate for 20 minutes, journal their gratitude, review their goals, and start their day with intention. They've read the books, followed the influencers, bought the planner. They know what successful people do, and they're determined to have the discipline to do it too. Tomorrow morning, when that alarm sounds in the darkness, they'll hit snooze again, and they'll feel that familiar shame settling over them like a weight. Another failure of willpower. Another day starting with self-disappointment. They'll promise themselves they'll do better tomorrow, unaware they're trapped in a cycle that a bitter German philosopher diagnosed nearly 2 centuries ago. What if I told you that your constant struggle with willpower isn't a personal failing? What if the entire framework of discipline and self-control that dominates modern self-help is built on a fundamental misunderstanding of human nature? What if a 19th century pessimist, dismissed by his contemporaries and celebrated by later generations, already explained why the harder you try to control yourself, the more you suffer? Tonight, we're going to explore an uncomfortable truth that challenges everything our productivity-obsessed culture teaches. We're going to encounter Arthur Schopenhauer, a philosopher so dark, so uncompromising in his vision of human existence, that his insights feel almost dangerous. Because once you understand what he discovered about the nature of will and desire, you can never look at your morning alarm, your diet plan, or your self-improvement goals the same way again. This isn't your typical philosophical sleep story. Schopenhauer doesn't offer comfort. He doesn't promise that understanding his ideas will make you more successful or disciplined or accomplished. In fact, he suggests the opposite. He suggests that the entire pursuit might be the problem, that your willpower isn't failing you, it never existed in the first place, that beneath your conscious control lies something far more powerful, far more ancient, far more indifferent to your goals than you could possibly imagine. Some of you might find this liberating. Others might find it terrifying. Many of you will drift off to sleep before we reach the end, which is perhaps the most Schopenhauerian response possible. Letting go of the struggle, surrendering to the natural rhythm that moves through you, whether you consent to it or not. So settle in, let your body relax. Release the tension in your shoulders, your jaw, the muscles you've been clenching without realizing it. Tonight, we're going to stop fighting. We're going to meet a philosopher who looked into the abyss of human striving and found not meaning, but an endless blind force that cares nothing for your productivity apps or morning routines. And strangely, there might be peace in that recognition. The year was 1788. And in the free city of Danzig, now Gdansk, in modern Poland, a child was born into wealth and privilege. His father, Heinrich Floris Schopenhauer, had built a successful merchant business, accumulating the kind of fortune that could guarantee his son a comfortable life. His mother, Johanna, was intelligent, ambitious, and far younger than her husband. The child they named Arthur seemed destined for the respectable life of a wealthy merchant's son. But nothing about Arthur Schopenhauer's life would be straightforward, and the seeds of his dark philosophy were planted in the soil of a troubled family. From his earliest years, Arthur was sensitive, introspective, prone to dark moods that troubled his pragmatic father. Heinrich had plans for his son. Arthur would join the family business, become a merchant, continue building the wealth and status the Schopenhauer name represented. but the boy showed intellectual inclinations that worried his father. Books, ideas, philosophy. These were dangerous interests for someone meant to count money and manage trade. When Arthur was 16, his father offered him a choice that would shape the rest of his life. He could either accompany his parents on an extended tour of Europe, after which he would apprentice as a merchant, or he could attend gymnasium to prepare for university. The tour won. Arthur chose the immediate gratification of travel over the abstract promise of education, a decision he would later regret. During that European journey, the young Schopenhauer witnessed suffering that branded itself into his consciousness. He saw poverty he had never imagined. He watched people living in conditions of such deprivation that his privileged existence seemed almost obscene by comparison. The gulf between human aspiration and human reality began to reveal itself to him, the distance between what people hoped for and what life actually delivered. When they returned to Danzig, Arthur began his merchant apprenticeship, and he was miserable. The work bored him. The future it promised felt like a prison sentence. He spent his days managing accounts and inventory, while his mind churned with questions about existence, meaning, and the nature of consciousness itself. Then came 1805, and the event that would crack open his world. His father fell from a warehouse loft and died. The official story was accident. The whispered story was suicide. Heinrich Floris Schopenhauer, the successful merchant, the practical man who had tried to shape his son into something sensible and profitable, had possibly thrown himself to his death. We can't know for certain what happened in that warehouse. Historical records are ambiguous, leaving space for both accident and intention. But Arthur believed his father had killed himself, and that belief became part of the architecture of his philosophy. Here was the first great lesson. Even wealth, even success, even the achievement of every practical goal couldn't shield a person from despair. The merchant life his father had chosen, the life he had tried to force on his son, had ended in a warehouse fall and a family's whispered shame. Arthur's mother, Johanna, responded to widowhood by becoming the person she had always wanted to be. She moved to Weimar, the cultural heart of Germany, and established herself as a writer and salonier. Her literary gatherings became famous. She hosted Goethe, the greatest German writer of the age. She published novels that were commercially successful. She thrived in precisely the cultural and intellectual world her husband had disdained, and she had no use for her morose, difficult son. The relationship between Arthur and Johanna became one of the most toxic mother-son dynamics in philosophical history. She found him depressing, critical, impossible to please. He found her superficial, vain, more interested in social success than genuine insight. They fought constantly. Their letters to each other dripped with mutual contempt. When Arthur was 30, Johanna finally wrote to him, requesting that he never contact her again. Mother and son never reconciled. She would outlive him by years, and when she died, there's no record that he mourned. This was the family soil from which Schopenhauer's philosophy grew, a possibly suicidal father, a mother who found her son's very presence unbearable, wealth that provided comfort but not meaning, and a young man increasingly convinced that beneath the surface of civilized life lurked something dark and desperate. With his father's inheritance, Arthur finally freed himself from the merchant career. He enrolled at the University of Göttingen to study medicine, then switched to philosophy, pursuing the intellectual life his nature demanded. But even in academia, he would never fit. He studied under philosophers who were building elaborate systems of German idealism, Fichte, Schelling, and most influentially, the philosopher he would come to despise, Georg Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel. Hegel was everything Schopenhauer wasn't. He was successful, respected, his lectures packed with students. His philosophy was optimistic, suggesting that history moved toward rational progress, that the unfolding of world spirit led toward ever greater freedom and understanding. He wrote in dense, nearly impenetrable prose that seemed designed to impress through obscurity. Schopenhauer hated him with a passion that bordered on obsession. He called Hegel a charlatan, an assassin of truth, a philosophical fraud whose success represented everything wrong with academic philosophy. When Schopenhauer eventually got a teaching position at the University of Berlin, he deliberately scheduled his lectures at the same time as Hegel's, imagining students would abandon the famous professor for his clearer, more honest philosophy. No one came to Schopenhauer's lectures. Hegel's hall remained packed. The humiliation was complete. This was Arthur Schopenhauer, the man. Wealthy but isolated, brilliant but bitter, capable of profound insight, but also petty cruelty. He once pushed an elderly seamstress down the stairs because her chattering annoyed him, an action that resulted in a lawsuit and a judgment requiring him to pay her a monthly pension for the rest of her life. When she finally died, decades later, he wrote in his account book, "The old woman dies, the burden leaves." He never married. He lived alone in a succession of apartments in Frankfurt, his only consistent companions a series of poodles he named Atman, a Sanskrit word meaning the universal self or soul. The choice of name reveals much. Even his pets were reminders of his philosophical preoccupations, that individual existence was illusory, that beneath apparent separateness lay a single universal force. He followed a rigid daily routine. Morning writing, a walk at precisely 11, lunch at the same restaurant, reading in the afternoon, the opera in the evening when available. He lived this disciplined life for decades, working on his philosophy in the mornings, a philosophy that would argue that all human discipline and striving was essentially futile. For most of his life, no one cared about his work. His magnum opus, The World as Will and Representation, published when he was 30, sold barely any copies. He would later publish a second volume, expanding and clarifying his ideas, and it too was largely ignored. He watched lesser thinkers achieve fame and positions, while his own insights gathered dust. Only in the last decade of his life, when he was already in his 60s, did recognition finally arrive. His collection of essays, Parerga and Paralipomena, written in a more accessible style, caught the attention of the reading public. Suddenly, people discovered this curmudgeonly old man living alone with his poodle had been working in obscurity on one of the most original philosophical systems in European history. By then, it was almost too late for Schopenhauer to enjoy it. He died in 1860, finally famous but still alone, found sitting in his apartment, having apparently suffered a heart attack. No family grieved him, no children carried his name, just the books, the ideas, the dark vision that would influence Nietzsche, Freud, Wagner, Einstein, Wittgenstein, and countless others who came after. This was the man who looked at human willpower and saw something we still struggle to accept. Now let's understand what he saw. To understand Schopenhauer's revolutionary and uncomfortable insight about willpower, we need to understand what he meant by will. And here's where things get strange, because when Schopenhauer talked about will, he wasn't talking about what we mean when we say willpower, or determination, or self-control. He was talking about something far more fundamental, far more disturbing. Schopenhauer proposed that beneath everything we see, beneath every object and every experience, Beneath the entire world of appearances, there exists a single underlying reality. He called it the will. Not a will, not your will or my will, but the will. A blind, aimless, incessant force that drives all of existence. This will has no purpose, no goal, no intention. It doesn't want anything specific. It just wants. It's pure wanting without direction, pure striving without end. It's the force that makes plants grow toward light, that makes animals hunt and mate, that makes your heart beat and your lungs breathe. And yes, that makes you reach for your phone when you're trying to focus. That makes you scroll endlessly when you meant to go to sleep. That makes you want things you don't need and pursue goals that won't satisfy you. The will, according to Schopenhauer, is reality itself. Everything else, every object you see, every person you meet, every thought you think, these are just appearances, representations of the will as it manifests in space and time. The world we experience is like a dream the will is having, and we're figures in that dream, convinced we're real, convinced we're separate, convinced we have control. This was a genuinely radical idea in 1818, when Schopenhauer published it. Most philosophy at that time, especially in Germany, was building elaborate systems where reason and consciousness were primary. Hegel and his idealist followers believed that history was the progressive unfolding of rational spirit. They saw consciousness, thought and logic as the fundamental features of reality. Schopenhauer turned this completely upside down. He said no, consciousness is secondary. Reason is a tool. Thought is a servant. The real master is something unconscious, something that existed before thought evolved, something that drives not just humans, but all of nature. The will is what's real. Your conscious mind, with all its plans and resolutions and self-improvement goals, is just a tiny flashlight trying to navigate in an ocean of darkness, and the current is so much stronger than the light. He drew this insight partly from his study of Immanuel Kant, the philosopher who had distinguished between phenomena, things as they appear to us, and noumena, things as they are in themselves. Kant had said we can never know the noumenal reality. Schopenhauer disagreed. He said we can know it, not through outward observation, but through inward experience. When you feel hunger, desire, pain, fear, love, you're not observing something external. You're experiencing the will directly from the inside. Every desire you feel, that's the will. Every urge, every craving, every restless impulse that makes you uncomfortable sitting still, that's not really you wanting something. It's the will wanting through you. You are not a person who happens to have desires. You are desires that happen to have the illusion of personhood. Schopenhauer also drew inspiration from Buddhist and Hindu philosophy, some of the first Western philosophers to seriously engage with Eastern thought. He recognized in Buddhist teachings about tanha, the thirst or craving that causes suffering, something similar to his concept of will. The Buddhist insight that attachment to desire causes suffering resonated deeply with his own conclusions. He saw the Indian philosophical tradition of Vedanta, with its recognition that individual selves are illusory manifestations of a deeper universal reality, as confirming his own vision. But Schopenhauer's will is bleaker than most Buddhist or Hindu concepts. It has no ultimate purpose, no cosmic intelligence, no potential for enlightenment built into its nature. It's just blind striving, endless and meaningless. The will doesn't care about your happiness or suffering. It doesn't care about anything because it can't care. It has no consciousness, no wisdom, no compassion. It just pushes forward, creating and destroying, building and tearing down, with the same indifference that a river shows to the rocks it wears away. Think about how this reframes every self-help book you've ever read, every motivational speech you've heard, every promise that you can achieve anything if you just want it badly enough. Schopenhauer is saying, the wanting itself is the problem. The desire to improve yourself is just the will creating another form to perpetuate its own pointless striving. The resolution to wake up early and be disciplined, that's the will. The failure to stick with it, that's also the will. The guilt and shame you feel afterward, still the will. The renewed determination to try again, you see where this is going. You're not fighting against your laziness or your lack of discipline. You're experiencing the will in conflict with itself, using your consciousness as the battlefield. The part of you that sets ambitious goals and the part that can't sustain them. They're both expressions of the same underlying force, just manifesting in different ways. And that force doesn't care which side wins, because there are no sides. There's just the will, endlessly wanting, endlessly dissatisfied, endlessly pushing forward into new forms of desire and frustration. Now here's where it gets really uncomfortable. If Schopenhauer is right, then the entire concept of willpower, in the sense of conscious control over your actions, is a kind of useful fiction. You think you're exercising willpower when you resist dessert or get up early or push through a workout. But really, you're just experiencing one manifestation of will, the one we call discipline or self-control, temporarily dominating another manifestation, the one we call temptation or laziness. Neither is more you than the other. Both are the will playing with itself. Your conscious mind, your sense of being a self who makes decisions, is what Schopenhauer called the intellect. And the intellect, he insisted, is not in charge. It's a tool the will uses for its own purposes. Think of your brain as a flashlight the will evolved to help navigate the physical world, to identify threats and opportunities, to make plans that serve the will's blind drive to persist and propagate. But the flashlight doesn't decide where it points. The hand holding it does, and the hand is the will. This explains something you've probably experienced countless times. You make a resolution. You know exactly what you should do. The logic is clear. The benefits are obvious. You're committed. And then, somehow, you don't do it. Or you do it for a while, and then you don't. And you can't fully explain why. It's not that you forgot. It's not that you didn't understand. It's that something beneath your conscious awareness simply didn't cooperate. The will wanted something else. Schopenhauer would say this is because the intellect can know, but it can't command. You can understand that you should exercise, but you can't make yourself want to exercise if the will is driving you toward rest or food or distraction. You can recognize that checking your phone is unproductive, but you can't stop the urge to do it because the urge isn't coming from the part of you that recognizes things. It's coming from something deeper, older, more fundamental than recognition or understanding. This is why all the productivity advice, all the discipline techniques, all the morning routines and habit trackers and accountability systems, they work until they don't. They're attempts by the intellect to control the will, and the intellect is like a rider on an elephant. In moments when the elephant happens to be going where the rider wants to go, the rider takes credit for their excellent riding skills. But when the elephant decides to do something else, all the rider's skill means nothing. The elephant goes where it goes, and the rider either hangs on or falls off. Modern neuroscience has confirmed much of what Schopenhauer intuited. We now know that most of what drives behavior happens beneath conscious awareness. Decisions form in the brain before we become consciously aware of making them. The feeling of conscious control appears to be, in many cases, the brain's way of creating a coherent narrative after the fact, We experience a desire to act, then we act, then we tell ourselves a story about how we consciously decided to act, but the causal chain might run backward from how it feels. Studies using brain imaging have shown that scientists can predict what decision a person will make several seconds before the person becomes aware of having made the decision. The conscious feeling of choice arrives late to a party the unconscious brain already started. This doesn't mean free will is completely illusory, but it suggests that what we call willpower is far less in control than we imagine. Schopenhauer didn't have functional MRI scans or neuroscience research. He had introspection, observation, and ruthless honesty about his own experience. And what he observed was that we don't generate our desires. They arise in us. They happen to us. We feel hunger. We don't decide to feel hunger. We feel attraction. We don't choose the objects of our desire. We feel ambition. But where did that ambition come from? If you trace back far enough, you find yourself standing on nothing. No ultimate self who chose to be the kind of person who has these particular desires rather than others. The implications for your relationship with willpower are profound. If Schopenhauer is right, then every time you fail to stick to a resolution, you're not revealing a personal weakness. You're revealing the fundamental condition of human existence. The will is not your servant. You are its instrument. The game was rigged from the start. And here's the most uncomfortable part. Recognizing this doesn't give you power over it. Understanding that your desires come from the will doesn't let you transcend the will. The understanding itself is just another tool the will is using. Even the desire to escape desire is a desire. Even the will to overcome, will is will. The trap is perfect, comprehensive, inescapable. Unless. But we'll get to Schopenhauer's proposed escape routes later. For now, let's stay with the trap, because understanding the trap fully is essential to understanding why your morning alarm keeps losing its battle with your snooze button, and why that battle is just a tiny skirmish in a war that's been going on since before you were born. A war between nothing and nothing, meaningless and endless. So if the will is this blind force driving all of existence, what does that mean for human experience? What does it feel like to be an expression of something that wants without end? Schopenhauer had a simple, devastating answer. It feels like suffering. All life, according to Schopenhauer, is suffering. This wasn't a psychological observation about depression or pessimism. It was a metaphysical claim about the fundamental nature of existence, because the will is essentially insatiable, and you are a manifestation of the will, you are essentially insatiable. Satisfaction is impossible by definition. The very structure of wanting guarantees dissatisfaction. Schopenhauer described life as a pendulum swinging between pain and boredom. When a desire is unfulfilled, we suffer from the wanting. The hunger hurts. The loneliness aches. The ambition gnaws at us. We're in a state of deprivation, lacking something we think we need, and this lack is experienced as pain. So we strive, we work, we scheme, we discipline ourselves, we pursue the thing we desire, and sometimes we get it. We achieve the goal. We obtain the object of desire. We experience a brief moment of relief, not even pleasure really, just the cessation of pain. The hunger is satisfied, but satisfaction means the end of hunger, not the presence of some positive joy. The absence of a negative, not the addition of a positive. And then what happens? Does this satisfaction last? Of course not. Either boredom sets in, as we realize that having the thing isn't as meaningful as wanting it was, or else new desires arise, often before we've even fully processed satisfying the old ones. We wanted the promotion, we got it. Now we want the next one. We wanted the relationship. We got it. Now we want it to be different than it is. We wanted to lose weight. We did. Now we want to lose more, or maintain it, or look different in some other way. The will doesn't stop. It can't stop. Wanting is its nature. Schopenhauer illustrated this with vivid examples that still resonate today. Consider the person who spends years dreaming of retirement, working toward that goal, sacrificing present enjoyment for future freedom. Finally, retirement arrives. And what happens? Within weeks or months, boredom sets in. The days feel empty. The freedom feels purposeless. Many retirees describe feeling lost, depressed, questioning what all that work was for, because the goal itself was never going to provide lasting satisfaction. The satisfaction was in having a goal, in the structured striving itself. Once achieved, the achievement is empty. Or consider romantic love, which Schopenhauer analyzed with particular brutality. We fall in love with such intensity, such certainty, that this person, this relationship, will fulfill us. We pursue them, we win them, we commit to them, and then what? In the best cases, the passionate intensity fades into comfortable affection. In the worst cases, it curdles into resentment and disappointment. Either way, the feeling that this person would complete us, that their love would satisfy our deepest longing, this feeling reveals itself as an illusion, not because we chose poorly, but because the promise itself was impossible. The will used the feeling of romantic love to drive us toward reproduction, toward the continuation of the species. Once that biological imperative is served, the will has no more use for the intense feeling. It fades because it was never about us, never about our happiness. It was the will ensuring its own continuation. This is the hedonic treadmill before psychology gave it that name. We adapt to whatever we achieve. The new becomes normal. The exceptional becomes expected. The thing we thought would change everything becomes just another part of the background. We're constantly chasing a satisfaction that recedes as we approach it, like a horizon that seems to move away as you walk toward it. But Schopenhauer went further. He observed that most of life isn't even the pendulum swing between pain and boredom. Most of life is just various forms of pain. The boredom itself is a kind of suffering. And between the pains of wanting and the boredom of having, we experience a constant low-grade anxiety about maintaining what we have, losing what we've gained, avoiding various potential losses and disasters. We worry, we fear, we anticipate suffering that hasn't happened yet, and in the anticipation we suffer now for future pains that might never arrive. He noted, with characteristic darkness, that we become aware of time when we're bored, not when we're engaged. When we're suffering, minutes drag. When we're absorbed, hours fly. Our happiest moments, then, are the ones we're least aware of, the ones that pass without our noticing. And this suggests something troubling, that our existence is happiest when we're least conscious of it, which would mean that consciousness itself is a burden, that awareness is suffering, that the more keenly we experience our own existence, the more we suffer. Think about your own experience of this. When are you most aware of yourself? Usually when something's wrong, when you're comfortable, healthy, content, engaged in something absorbing, you forget yourself. You're not constantly monitoring your own existence. But when you're in pain, when you're anxious, when you're uncomfortable, suddenly you're intensely aware of being a self who is experiencing this discomfort. Self-consciousness and suffering go together. The more you're thinking about yourself, the more you're probably suffering. Schopenhauer looked at human history and saw this pattern everywhere. Wars, exploitation, cruelty, injustice, all products of the will's endless striving expressed through humans. The competition for resources, for mates, for status, for power, it never ends. It can't end. Every generation suffers its own version of want and disappointment. Every person lives out the same basic story, born into a world not of their choosing, driven by desires they didn't select, pursuing satisfactions that never satisfy, declining into old age and death. The specific details change, but the fundamental structure of suffering remains constant. And here's where Schopenhauer becomes relevant to your struggle with discipline and willpower. All those self-improvement efforts, all those attempts to cultivate better habits, more discipline, greater consistency, they're part of the cycle of suffering. You're not suffering because you lack discipline. You're suffering because you desire discipline, because you want to be different than you are, because the will is manifesting in you as dissatisfaction with your current state and striving toward an imagined future state. The productivity advice, the morning routines, the habit trackers, the accountability systems, they promise relief from the suffering of being undisciplined. But even when they work, they don't work the way you hope. You become more disciplined, and what changes? You're still not satisfied. Now you suffer from the effort of maintaining the discipline, or you achieve some goal the discipline enabled, and the achievement is hollow. Or new desires arise, new areas where you're still inadequate, still falling short. The modern self-improvement industry has sold millions of people on a simple story. You're suffering because you lack discipline. Develop more willpower, more consistency, better systems, and you'll be happy. This is exactly backward, Schopenhauer would say. You lack discipline because you're suffering, and you're suffering because you're alive, because you're an expression of the will, and the will is essentially frustrated. Cultivating discipline doesn't end the suffering, it just changes its form. Now you suffer the pain of self-denial, the constant monitoring, the guilt when you slip, the fear of losing the discipline you've worked so hard to build. There's no way out through striving because striving is the problem. Every goal achieved creates the space for a new goal. Every desire satisfied makes room for a new desire. Every version of yourself you become is immediately supplanted by a vision of a better self you could become. The race has no finish line because the course regenerates behind you as you run. This is why people who achieve everything they thought they wanted often report feeling empty. The success story is supposed to end with satisfaction, but it doesn't. The entrepreneur builds the billion-dollar company and feels lost. The artist achieves recognition and feels fraudulent. The athlete wins the championship and faces the terrifying question, what now? Because the goal was never the point. The striving was the point. Or rather, the striving was inevitable, and the goal was just a direction for the striving to take. Schopenhauer would look at modern burnout culture and nod grimly. Of course you're exhausted. You're trying to do the impossible. You're trying to satisfy something that cannot be satisfied. You're trying to achieve a stable state of contentment through actions that are themselves expressions of discontentment. Every effort to improve yourself is an acknowledgement that you're not enough as you are, and this acknowledgement is itself suffering. The more successful you are at self-improvement, the more you've internalized the message that you need improving. You can't win, and social media amplifies this to a point Schopenhauer couldn't have imagined. Now you don't just compare yourself to your neighbors and the people in your town. You compare yourself to the carefully curated highlight reels of millions of people, each showing their best moments, their biggest achievements, their most impressive discipline. The bar keeps rising. The inadequacy becomes more acute. The will finds new forms for its striving, new objects for its desire, new ways to make you feel like you're falling short. The exhaustion you feel isn't laziness. It's the natural result of trying to run on a treadmill that speeds up every time you get used to the pace. The frustration you experience when you can't maintain your routines isn't weakness. It's recognition that the system doesn't work, that the promise was false, that no amount of optimization will ever be enough, because enough isn't a place the will can reach. As you settle deeper into rest tonight, consider the possibility that your struggles with discipline aren't failures. They're recognitions. Somewhere beneath your conscious awareness, some part of you knows the game is rigged, knows that achieving the perfectly disciplined life won't end your suffering, knows that the will can't be satisfied by waking up early or tracking your habits or following the perfect morning routine. And so that part of you resists, not out of weakness, but out of wisdom. A wisdom that your conscious mind, trained by our culture to value striving and achievement, can't quite articulate. The resistance itself might be the healthiest response to an impossible demand. Now we arrive at perhaps the most challenging part of Schopenhauer's philosophy for modern people, raised on notions of willpower and self-discipline, the illusion of control. We like to think we're in charge of ourselves. That's the premise of every self-help book, every productivity system, every motivational speech. You can control your actions. You can change your habits. You can become the person you want to be. It just takes discipline, consistency, willpower. This is so obviously true, so fundamental to how we think about personal development, that questioning it seems absurd. But Schopenhauer questioned everything, and he questioned this most of all. Are you really in control? Are the decisions you make really yours? When you feel yourself willing an action, choosing a path, exercising discipline, what exactly is doing the willing? Let's conduct a simple thought experiment, one Schopenhauer himself suggested. Right now, sitting or lying there, can you will yourself to genuinely want something you don't want? Not to pretend to want it, not to understand intellectually why you should want it, but to actually want it with the same immediacy and force you feel when you want something you really want. Try it. Pick something you currently have no desire for, maybe a food you dislike, or an activity that bores you. Now, will yourself to want it, not to do it, to want it. Can you? Can you generate authentic desire through an act of will? Of course not. Desires arise. They appear in consciousness. You become aware of wanting something, but you don't decide to want it. The wanting comes first, and then you notice it. This is obvious with physical desires like hunger or thirst. You don't choose to become hungry. You discover that you are hungry. But it's equally true for more complex desires. You don't choose what interests you, what attracts you, what ambitions stir in you. These things well up from somewhere beneath consciousness, and you experience them as givens. Now, you can choose whether to act on a desire. That seems like control. I'm hungry, but I don't eat because I'm fasting. I'm attracted, but I don't pursue because I'm committed to someone else. I want to stay in bed, but I get up because I have responsibilities. This is willpower, right? This is control. Schopenhauer would say, not exactly. When you resist one desire, you're not really controlling the will. You're experiencing one manifestation of will overriding another. The will manifests as hunger, but it also manifests as the desire to be thin or healthy, or to honor a commitment you made. The will manifests as sexual attraction, but it also manifests as the desire to maintain a relationship, or avoid complications, or uphold certain values. When one wins over the other, it's not you controlling the will. It's the will in one form outweighing the will in another form. The intellect, your conscious reasoning mind, can recognize which desire serves longer-term interests. It can calculate that eating now will undermine weight loss goals, so resisting eating is strategically better. But the intellect can't make you not want to eat. It can only hope that the desire for long-term results happens to be stronger in this moment than the desire for immediate satisfaction. Sometimes it is, sometimes it isn't, and you don't really control which. Think about addiction for a moment, because it illustrates this point starkly. An addicted person knows intellectually that using their substance of choice is harmful. Their intellect has all the information it needs. They understand the consequences. They may desperately want to stop. They may have tried repeatedly. They may hate themselves for their inability to quit, but the knowledge doesn't give them control. Understanding the problem isn't the same as having power over it. The will, manifesting as addiction, is stronger than their intellectual knowledge or their conscious desire to change. The intellect can see what should happen, but it can't make it happen. Now, is everyone an addict? No. But Schopenhauer would suggest that the difference between an addicted person and a non-addicted person isn't that one has willpower and the other doesn't. It's that, in one case, the will happens to express itself through addiction, and in the other case, it doesn't. The non-addicted person doesn't deserve credit for their self-control any more than a person deserves credit for not being allergic to peanuts. It's just how the will happens to be configured in them. This sounds fatalistic, and in a sense it is. If your desires arise from the will, and the will is beyond your control, then how are you responsible for anything? Schopenhauer wrestled with this question. He distinguished between what he called empirical character and intelligible character. Your empirical character is how you actually behave in the world, your patterns of action and reaction. Your intelligible character is the underlying nature that produces those behaviors, the basic configuration of will in your particular manifestation. You can't change your intelligible character. It's what you are at the deepest level. But within the constraints of that character, you still make choices, or at least experience yourself as making choices. The choices themselves are determined by your character interacting with circumstances, but they're still your choices in the sense that they flow from your nature. This is compatibilism of a sort, the philosophical position that determinism and responsibility can coexist. But Schopenhauer's version offers little comfort to someone struggling with willpower, because it suggests that if you're the kind of person who struggles with discipline, that's your intelligible character. You can learn strategies, you can manipulate circumstances to make good behavior more likely, but you can't fundamentally change what you are. A person with weak discipline is like a person with poor eyesight. They can get glasses, they can learn to navigate despite the limitation, but they can't will themselves to see better. Modern neuroscience has provided some disquieting confirmation of Schopenhauer's view. Studies of decision-making show that brain activity associated with a decision begins several seconds before a person becomes consciously aware of having made the decision. Researchers can predict what choice a person will make based on brain scans taken before the person reports having decided. This doesn't prove free will doesn't exist, but it suggests that what we experience as the moment of conscious choice is actually a later step in a process that began unconsciously. The conscious experience of willing, of "I am now choosing to do this," appears to be the brain's way of taking credit for something that already started happening beneath awareness. This is deeply unsettling. It suggests that the feeling of being in control might be an illusion the brain creates to make sense of actions that were actually initiated by unconscious processes. You think you're the executive making decisions, But you might be more like the press secretary explaining decisions that have already been made by parts of the government you can't even access. For anyone trying to develop willpower and discipline, this is devastating, because it suggests that all your efforts to control yourself might be you watching yourself be controlled, experiencing the outcome as if it were your doing, when really it's the will doing what the will does, and your conscious mind is just along for the ride, sometimes protesting, sometimes approving, but never truly in charge. You've experienced this. Those moments when you're watching yourself do something you know you shouldn't, almost as an observer of your own behavior. Eating the thing you resolved not to eat. Saying the thing you meant to keep to yourself. Scrolling when you promised yourself you'd sleep. In those moments, the illusion of control becomes thin enough to see through. You're not deciding to do the behavior. You're watching it happen, aware of it, unable to stop it. The intellect observes. The will acts. And later, the intellect constructs a story that makes it seem like you were in control all the time. Schopenhauer suggested that self-knowledge, truly honest self-knowledge, comes from observing your own behavior over time and accepting what you see, not what you wish were true, not what you resolve to become, but what you actually are. Most people live in constant denial about their own nature. They believe their aspirations are their identity. They think the person they want to be is the person they are. And this creates endless suffering, because reality keeps contradicting the story. The person who always resolves to wake up early but never does is suffering from a mismatch between their self-concept and their nature. They think they're the kind of person who wakes up early, or could be, if they just tried harder, had more discipline, really committed this time. But maybe they're not. Maybe their circadian rhythm, their energy patterns, their fundamental nature simply isn't configured for early rising. All the willpower in the world can't make you something you're not. You can force yourself for a while, but it's exhausting, and eventually the facade cracks. Accepting this doesn't mean giving up. It means working with reality instead of against it. If you're not a morning person, structure your life around that instead of fighting it. If you have limited discipline for certain activities, build systems that don't require discipline. If certain desires are very strong in you, arrange your environment to reduce exposure to triggers instead of relying on willpower to resist. This is the paradox at the heart of Schopenhauer's philosophy of control. You have no ultimate control over your nature or your desires, but you have some limited ability to work with what you are, to arrange circumstances to channel the will's energy in less harmful directions. You can't stop being driven by the will, but you might be able to avoid crashing quite as often. The uncomfortable truth is that willpower, as commonly understood, doesn't exist. There's no reservoir of strength you can draw on to override your nature. There's just the will, manifesting in various forms, some of which we label as discipline, and others we label as temptation. When discipline wins, we take credit. When temptation wins, we blame ourselves. But both outcomes are just the will doing what it does. And the self that claims credit or accepts blame is itself just another representation, another appearance, another way the will has of confusing itself about its own nature. As you drift towards sleep, notice how little control you have over that too. You can't will yourself to sleep. You can create conditions that make sleep more likely, but the actual transition from waking to sleeping happens to you, not by you. You release control because you have to. And in that release, that letting go, there might be wisdom about the rest of life. Maybe control was always an illusion. Maybe you've been exhausting yourself trying to do something that was never possible. Maybe the relief you feel as consciousness fades isn't just tiredness. Maybe it's a temporary escape from the burden of pretending to be in charge of something you never controlled in the first place. The research psychologists called it ego depletion, and for a while, it seemed like the scientific validation of something everyone intuitively understood. Willpower was like a muscle. Use it, and it gets tired. A series of studies beginning in the late 1990s appeared to demonstrate this elegantly. The implications were profound, and the idea caught fire in both academic psychology and popular culture. The most famous of these studies, conducted by Roy Baumeister and his colleagues in 1998, had a clever setup. They brought research participants into a room that smelled of fresh-baked chocolate chip cookies. On a table sat two bowls. One contained those warm chocolate chip cookies. The other contained radishes. Participants were told they were participating in a study about taste perception, and they were randomly assigned to either eat cookies or eat radishes. For the cookie group, easy and pleasant. For the radish group, torture. Sitting there, smelling chocolate, looking at cookies, being forced to eat bland radishes instead. This required willpower, self-control, the suppression of a natural desire. Afterward, both groups were given a supposedly unrelated task. Geometric puzzles that were actually impossible to solve. The researchers measured how long participants persisted before giving up. The results seemed clear. The radish eaters gave up much faster than the cookie eaters. They had depleted their willpower resisting the cookies, so they had less remaining for the puzzle. The muscle was tired. The resource was exhausted. Willpower was limited, and using it in one domain meant having less available for another. Subsequent studies found ego depletion effects everywhere. People who suppressed emotions showed reduced physical stamina afterward. People who had to make difficult decisions showed less self-control on subsequent tasks. People who forced themselves to remain focused showed reduced ability to resist temptation later. The pattern seemed robust, and the mechanism made intuitive sense. The implications were immediately relevant to anyone trying to improve their discipline or build better habits. If willpower depletes like a battery, then several things follow. First, don't try to change everything at once. You'll run out of willpower. Second, do your most important tasks requiring self-control early in the day when your willpower is fresh. Third, understand that failures of discipline might not be moral failings, but simple resource exhaustion. Books were written. Articles appeared in major publications. The idea that willpower is limited became conventional wisdom. It explained so much. Why diets fail. Why people lose control at the end of the day. Why stress makes self-control harder. Why decision fatigue is real. The tired muscle metaphor became part of how we understood our own struggles with discipline. But science has this awkward feature. It's supposed to be self-correcting. And in the 2010s, psychology underwent what's been called the replication crisis. Researchers tried to repeat famous studies to verify their findings, and many didn't replicate. Results that seemed solid turned out to be artifacts of questionable research practices, small sample sizes, or statistical flukes. In 2016, a massive coordinated effort involving 23 different laboratories tried to replicate the ego depletion effect using a carefully controlled procedure that was registered in advance to prevent any fudging of methods or statistics after the fact. More than 3,000 participants, rigorous protocols, multiple research teams. The result? Nothing. No ego depletion effect. The data were actually 4 times more likely to support the conclusion that there is no effect than that there is one. This wasn't just one failed replication. It was a coordinated effort, specifically designed to give the ego depletion effect every opportunity to show itself. And it didn't. The tired willpower muscle might not exist. But wait, what about all those previous studies? What about the intuitive sense that willpower feels limited? What about the clear experience of being more likely to break your diet at night than in the morning? Here's where it gets interesting. Follow-up research suggested that ego depletion effects appeared most strongly when people believed willpower was limited. If you think self-control is a limited resource that gets depleted, then you experience depletion. If you think willpower is unlimited, or at least not easily depleted, you don't show the effect. In one revealing study, participants who were led to believe that willpower doesn't get depleted showed no depletion effect, even after doing depleting tasks. Their beliefs shaped their experience. The limitation wasn't in some objective resource being exhausted. It was in the expectation that resources should be exhausted. Other studies found that motivation mattered tremendously. When people were offered money or other incentives for performing well on the second task, ego depletion effects disappeared. If willpower were really a depleted resource like physical energy, incentives shouldn't magically restore it. You can't will yourself to be less physically tired, but apparently you can will yourself to have more willpower, which creates a strange paradox. Willpower to restore willpower. What's powering that will? The more researchers looked, the less solid ego depletion seemed. Some studies found effects, others didn't. The effect sizes were small. Individual differences were large. Context mattered. Beliefs mattered. Motivation mattered. This didn't look like a depleting biological resource. It looked like something psychological, malleable, belief-dependent. Now, Schopenhauer would have found this entire research program deeply ironic. Here were scientists trying to measure willpower as if it were a substance, a thing, a resource that could be quantified and depleted. But Schopenhauer understood that the will is not a possession. You don't have will in varying amounts. You are will, or more precisely, you're a particular manifestation of the will. The question isn't how much willpower you have. The question is what form the will happens to be taking in this moment. The ego depletion researchers were unconsciously creating a Schopenhauerian experiment. They were showing that what we call willpower is not a stable resource, but a fluctuating expression of underlying drives, shaped by beliefs, contexts, meanings, and motivations. Sometimes the will manifests as discipline. Sometimes it manifests as resistance to discipline. Neither state is more real or fundamental than the other. Both are just the will doing what it does. The belief effects are particularly telling. If believing willpower is limited makes it limited, and believing it's unlimited makes it unlimited, or at least more available, then what exactly are we measuring? Not some objective resource, clearly. We're measuring something psychological, something shaped by narrative and expectation and meaning. Schopenhauer would recognize this immediately. The intellect creates stories about the will. It tells itself, I have strong willpower, or I have weak willpower, or my willpower is depleted. And these stories shape how the will expresses itself through behavior. The story becomes part of the cause, but the underlying reality, the will itself, doesn't actually get stronger or weaker. It just is. It manifests in different ways, depending on countless factors, including what the intellect believes about it. This has profound implications for anyone struggling with discipline. The entire framework of building willpower or conserving willpower might be based on a misunderstanding. You're not building or conserving a resource. You're changing the conditions under which the will expresses itself. You're altering beliefs, context, meanings, structures. These changes can absolutely affect behavior, but they're not strengthening some metaphorical muscle. They're reshaping the overall pattern of forces that produce action. Think about what this means for the advice that flows from ego depletion theory. Do the hard things first when your willpower is fresh. But if depletion is largely belief-based, then maybe the issue isn't that willpower is actually lower at night. Maybe it's that you believe it should be lower, so it is. Maybe the advice itself creates the limitation by reinforcing the belief in depletion. Or consider the advice to not try changing too many things at once because you'll run out of willpower. But if willpower isn't really depleting, then maybe the issue is that multiple changes create complexity and uncertainty, which the will resists not because it's tired, but because uncertainty and complexity are inherently aversive. The real limitation isn't depleted willpower. It's the basic fact that the will doesn't like difficult, uncertain, unrewarding situations, regardless of how much willpower you've supposedly used earlier. The uncomfortable truth emerging from the ego depletion controversy is that willpower, as commonly conceived, probably doesn't exist. There's no reservoir that empties. There's no muscle that tires in quite the way we imagine. What exists is a continuous flow of motivations, desires, aversions, beliefs, and contexts that together shape what we do moment by moment. Sometimes these factors align to produce what we call disciplined behavior. Sometimes they don't. We retroactively label one state as having willpower and the other as lacking willpower. But these labels are descriptions, not explanations. Schopenhauer, who never heard of ego depletion or cognitive psychology or neural networks, understood this more clearly than the researchers who spent decades studying it. The will doesn't get tired because it's not the kind of thing that can get tired. It's not a resource. It's reality itself, or the fundamental nature of reality, expressing itself through every impulse, every desire, every aversion, every choice. You can't deplete reality. You can only experience it manifesting in different ways. As you settle deeper into rest, notice how this changes the way you think about your own struggles. When you fail to stick with that diet, that exercise program, that morning routine, were you really low on willpower? Or was the will simply manifesting as hunger, fatigue, preference for comfort, informed stronger than the desire for long-term health? When you succeeded, did you really have more willpower? Or did circumstances happen to align so that the will's expression led to the behavior you wanted? The relief in recognizing this is subtle but profound. You're not failing at something you should be able to control. You're experiencing the fundamental condition of being alive, being an expression of forces beyond your control. The struggle isn't personal, it's metaphysical. And maybe, just maybe, the way out isn't to fight harder. Maybe it's to stop fighting in quite the same way. But that suggestion leads us to questions of solutions, and those require their own consideration. The modern world is organized around a simple assumption. More is better. More money, more success, more experiences, more followers, more achievements, more goals accomplished, more items crossed off the list. And to get more, you need discipline. You need to optimize. You need to maximize your potential. You need willpower to push yourself beyond your current limits into expanded versions of what you can have and be and do. This is so fundamental to how we think that questioning it seems absurd. Obviously, you should want to improve yourself. Obviously, you should strive for goals. Obviously, you should seek growth and advancement and the realization of your potential. To suggest otherwise sounds like giving up, like resignation, like the voice of depression or laziness or failure. But Schopenhauer looked at this entire framework and saw something different. He saw the will creating endless forms of desire, each one promising satisfaction, none delivering it. He saw striving itself as the problem, not the solution. And he saw that adding more goals, more ambitions, more things to achieve was just feeding the beast, giving the will more material to work with in creating suffering. Consider the modern productivity and self-improvement industry. It promises that if you just get organized enough, disciplined enough, consistent enough, you'll achieve your goals and find satisfaction. But watch what happens to people who fully embrace this. They become extraordinarily productive. They achieve remarkable things, and they're often more anxious, more stressed, more dissatisfied than when they started. Because productivity culture doesn't end the cycle of wanting. It accelerates it. Now you're not just wanting things, you're wanting them efficiently. You're measuring and tracking and optimizing your wanting. You've turned the will's striving into a sophisticated system, but the system just makes you strive more effectively. It doesn't end the striving, it perfects it. The person who wakes at 5 does their morning routine, tracks their habits, optimizes their diet and exercise, builds their side business while working full-time, and maintains an impressive social media presence, documenting their productivity. This person is not free from the will. They're completely dominated by it. The will has manifested in them as an intense drive to achieve, and they've built an entire identity around serving that drive. The discipline they've cultivated isn't mastery over the will. It's the will's most effective form yet, streamlined, systematized, relentless. And what's the result? Look at the faces in your Instagram feed or the people in your LinkedIn network who seem to have it all together. How many of them look genuinely at peace? How many radiate contentment as opposed to the kind of tired determination that comes from winning battles but never winning the war? They've achieved things. They've built businesses or careers or bodies or Instagram followings. And the achievements are real, but the satisfaction is strangely elusive. There's always the next goal, the next level, the next optimization to implement. Schopenhauer would say this is inevitable, because the entire pursuit is misguided. You're trying to satisfy something that cannot be satisfied. The will doesn't want specific things. It wants wanting. Achievement doesn't end desire. It just updates the object of desire. The entrepreneur who sells her company for millions and feels empty isn't being ungrateful or broken. She's discovering what Schopenhauer could have told her from the start. The money wasn't the point. The striving was the point. And now the striving has lost its object, leaving her with nothing but the raw dissatisfaction that was there all along, temporarily obscured by the pursuit. Social media has created a particularly vicious amplification of this dynamic. Now, you're not just comparing yourself to people you know. You're comparing yourself to an endless stream of carefully curated highlight reels. Everyone's best moments, most impressive achievements, most flattering angles. The bar for what counts as adequate keeps rising. The standards for discipline and success and achievement become more extreme. And the feeling of falling short becomes more acute. You want to lose weight. You see people online with perfect bodies. You want to be productive. You see people who seem to accomplish more in a day than you do in a week. You want financial success. You see young people buying houses and traveling the world while you're struggling to save. Every desire you have is immediately contextualized within a framework of comparison that makes your current state inadequate. This creates what we might call chronic low-grade dissatisfaction as the default state. You're always behind, always not enough, always needing to improve and catch up and become better. And the solution offered is always the same. More discipline, more willpower, better systems, try harder, be more consistent, optimize, measure, track, push. But notice what this does. It means you're never allowed to just be. You're always becoming. And becoming is inherently dissatisfying because it's defined by the gap between what you are and what you're trying to become. The very structure of self-improvement requires you to be inadequate in order to have something to improve toward. The better you get at productivity and discipline, the more you've internalized the message that you're not enough as you are. Schopenhauer saw this pattern in his own time, long before Instagram and self-help books. He saw people chasing wealth, status, achievement, convinced that the next milestone would bring satisfaction, and he saw that it never did. The wealthy envied the wealthier. The successful craved more success. The famous wanted more fame. There was no natural stopping point because the wanting itself was the will's nature, not a temporary condition that achieving goals would cure. He noted the particular suffering of ambition. The ambitious person is by definition dissatisfied with their current position. Their ambition drives them forward, and this drive can lead to remarkable achievements. But the achievement itself is immediately integrated into their baseline expectations, and new ambitions arise. The CEO who spent years climbing to that position spends maybe a month enjoying the achievement before becoming dissatisfied again, now wanting to expand the company or increase profits or gain recognition from peers or outdo competitors. The will never says enough, it only says more. This is why so many of the most objectively successful people report feeling driven in ways that don't feel entirely voluntary. They describe themselves as unable to rest, unable to enjoy what they've achieved, always feeling pushed toward the next thing. We admire this as superhuman work ethic or extraordinary drive. Schopenhauer would see it as the will in a particularly pure form, with minimal restraint from reason or recognition of the futility of striving. The modern epidemic of burnout makes perfect sense in this framework. People are finally hitting the limits of how much striving they can sustain. The will pushes them to achieve, society rewards the achievement and demands more, and eventually the body or mind reaches a breaking point. The burnout isn't mysterious. It's the inevitable result of trying to satisfy something insatiable. You can't succeed at an impossible task. You can only exhaust yourself attempting it. And here's the cruelest twist. When people burn out, the solution offered is often more of the same. You need to take care of yourself. You need better boundaries. You need more discipline about rest. You need systems for managing stress. You need to optimize your recovery so you can get back to striving more efficiently. Burnout itself becomes another problem to solve, another area to apply willpower and discipline and systematic improvement. Schopenhauer would recognize this as the will in self-referential recursion, creating suffering, then creating the desire to end suffering, then creating systems to manage the suffering, then creating suffering from the failure of those systems, then creating new desires for better systems, forever and ever without end. What's the alternative? If striving is suffering and achievement doesn't end striving, what are you supposed to do? Just give up on everything? Become passive and accept whatever happens? This sounds like a recipe for poverty, failure, and a different kind of misery. Schopenhauer's answer is complex, and we'll explore it more fully in the coming sections. But the first step is simply recognition. Recognizing that your desires for self-improvement are not solutions to the problem of desire. They're new forms of the same problem. Recognizing that discipline and willpower are not paths to liberation from the will. They're ways the will manifests and perpetuates itself. Recognizing that the entire framework of achieving satisfaction through striving is built on a foundation that can't support the weight. This recognition doesn't immediately solve anything, but it shifts something. Maybe you still pursue goals. Maybe you still try to improve, but perhaps with less attachment to the outcome. Perhaps with recognition that the goal itself isn't really the point, that achieving it won't feel like you expect, that the satisfaction will be temporary at best. Perhaps with more compassion for yourself when you fail, because you understand that you're not failing at something you should be able to succeed at. You're discovering the same truth every generation discovers, that human beings are fundamentally driven by forces they don't control. And peace doesn't come from winning the battle against those forces. As sleep pulls at your consciousness, notice how willingly you surrender. You're not fighting it. You're not trying to stay awake through sheer discipline. You're letting go, releasing control, allowing yourself to drift. This is not failure. This is wisdom. The wisdom of knowing when to stop striving. Maybe that wisdom could extend to your waking life. Maybe not every moment needs to be optimized, improved, disciplined towards some future goal. Maybe sometimes, more often than we allow, the right response is to simply stop, to rest, to let the will do what it does without identifying with it so completely, to watch the striving happen, the desires arise and fade, the ambitions surge and recede, all while maintaining some small space of awareness that isn't caught up in the drama, that sees it all as the eternal pattern playing itself out one more time in one more temporary form, meaning nothing, going nowhere, and somehow, in that recognition, finding a strange sort of peace. Now we arrive at what might seem like a contradiction in Schopenhauer's philosophy. If striving creates suffering, and the will is essentially about striving, and we can't escape being manifestations of the will, then what's the point of his philosophy? Is he just describing an inescapable prison? Not quite, because Schopenhauer proposed something that might seem impossible given everything we've discussed. He suggested that there could be moments, even extended periods, when the will's grip loosens, when suffering lessens not because desire is satisfied, but because desire itself temporarily subsides. And the path to these moments, strangely enough, is through compassion. This is one of the most surprising aspects of Schopenhauer's thought. This grim pessimist, this misanthrope who pushed old ladies downstairs and lived alone with his dog, developed one of the most profound philosophical accounts of compassion in Western thought. The key insight is this: individual existence is illusion. When you look at yourself and see a separate person with your own interests, your own desires, your own perspective distinct from everyone else's, you're experiencing what Schopenhauer called representation. You're seeing the world through the lens of space, time, and causation, the forms that your intellect imposes on reality. These forms make it appear that you're a separate being among other separate beings, each pursuing your own survival and satisfaction. But at the deeper level of the will itself, this separation doesn't exist. The will is one. It's the same force manifesting in every living thing. The will in you and the will in me, they're not two wills. They're the same will experiencing itself from different perspectives. Most of the time, we don't recognize this. We're caught up in the illusion of separateness. We see other people as obstacles or tools or threats or opportunities, all in relation to our own individual interests. This is natural. This is how the will ensures its own continuation in each particular organism. If you didn't treat your own survival as paramount, you wouldn't survive. The will needs you to believe you're separate and special and worth preserving. But sometimes, in certain experiences, the illusion can crack. You see another person suffering, and something shifts. Instead of seeing their suffering as separate from you, irrelevant to your interests. You feel it. Not theoretically, not through some conscious reasoning about how you should care about others. You just feel it immediately, as if it were your own. This is compassion, literally suffering with. And Schopenhauer saw it as metaphysically significant, because it's a moment when the illusion of separateness dissolves. In feeling another's pain as your own, you're recognizing at some level that you and they are manifestations of the same will. The separation is appearance, the unity is reality. Now, you might think, okay, but how does this help with willpower or discipline or the struggle with desire? What does compassion have to do with your morning alarm or your diet or your productivity? The connection is subtle but profound. When you're caught in egocentric desire, when you're striving for your goals, your achievements, your improvement, you're caught in the illusion of separate selfhood. The entire framework of personal development presupposes that you're an individual who can become better, achieve more, transcend your current limitations. This perspective keeps you trapped in the cycle of desire and dissatisfaction, because it's based on the fundamental error of taking the ego seriously. But compassion requires a different perspective. To genuinely feel another's suffering means temporarily releasing your own perspective. Your concerns recede. Your goals seem less urgent. The entire structure of personal ambition loosens its grip. In moments of genuine compassion, you're not thinking about optimizing yourself or achieving your goals. You're thinking about alleviating someone else's pain, and your own desires fade into the background. Schopenhauer saw this as the beginning of what he called denial of the will. Not complete denial, not permanent escape, but temporary relief from the will's incessant demanding. When you're genuinely compassionate, the will is, in a sense, quieter. It's still there, still manifesting, but it's not screaming quite so loudly. Its grip loosens just enough to allow breathing room. This has implications for how you relate to your own struggles with willpower and discipline. The usual framework is deeply egocentric. I want to be more disciplined. I want to achieve my goals. I want to improve myself. Every sentence structured around I and my and me. This reinforces the separate ego that Schopenhauer identified as the source of suffering. But what if you shifted perspective? What if instead of trying to discipline yourself for your own improvement, you considered how your actions affect others? Not in some calculating way, not as a trick to motivate yourself, but genuinely. The person who gets enough sleep is more patient with their family. The person who maintains their health is less likely to become a burden on loved ones. The person who manages their finances responsibly doesn't create stress for their partner. This isn't a different way to pursue the same goals. It's a different framework entirely. One where the center of concern shifts from your individual achievement to the web of relationships and connections in which you exist. One where discipline isn't about self-optimization, but about reducing the suffering you cause others. Schopenhauer would say this shift doesn't give you more willpower, but it might change how the will manifests. When you're operating from genuine concern for others rather than egocentric ambition, the entire quality of your striving changes. It's less frantic, less driven by that particular form of suffering that comes from feeling inadequate. The suffering that motivates compassionate action feels different from the suffering that motivates self-improvement. Both are still suffering, still the will in some form, but one perpetuates the ego while the other begins to dissolve it. This connects to something else Schopenhauer emphasized. The way to reduce suffering isn't to satisfy desires, but to reduce desire itself. And one of the most effective ways to reduce desire is to recognize that the self doing the desiring isn't what you think it is. The ego that wants to be more disciplined, more productive, more successful, This ego is a kind of fiction, a useful fiction for navigating the practical world, but still a fiction. When you recognize this through acts of genuine compassion, something strange happens. Your own problems seem less absolute. Your own goals seem less urgent. Not because you've reasoned your way to that conclusion, but because you've temporarily experienced yourself as less separate, less isolated, less special than you usually feel. And in that experience, the relentless pressure to improve and achieve and become someone better eases, not through satisfaction, but through seeing that the entire drama was always less significant than it seemed. The person caught in productivity culture, trying to optimize every hour, track every metric, achieve every goal, is suffering from an excess of ego. They've taken their separate individual existence too seriously. They believe that their achievements matter in some ultimate sense, that their discipline or lack of discipline defines their worth, that their success or failure is tremendously important. Compassion offers a different perspective. When you're genuinely concerned with alleviating others' suffering, your own achievement seems less critical. This doesn't mean you become passive or stop trying to improve, but the quality of the effort changes. It's less driven by ego, less freighted with meaning, less liable to create that particular form of suffering that comes from investing your identity in your accomplishments. Modern research on well-being has actually confirmed something Schopenhauer suggested. People who focus on helping others, who engage in activities oriented toward others' welfare rather than their own advancement, report higher levels of satisfaction and meaning. This isn't because helping others satisfies some desire. It's because the orientation toward others temporarily releases them from the prison of ego-centered concern. The volunteer who spends time working in a soup kitchen isn't improving themselves in the productivity sense. They're not optimizing, not advancing their career, not building their personal brand. But they often report feeling more satisfied, more grounded, more connected than when they're focused on their own advancement. Schopenhauer would say this is because they're experiencing temporary relief from the will as it manifests in egocentric desire. The will is still there, still operating, but it's manifesting in a form that creates less suffering. This doesn't mean compassion is easy or natural or something you can simply decide to feel. Genuine compassion, the kind that involves really feeling another's suffering rather than performing concern or following moral rules, is rare and difficult. Most of what passes for compassion is actually just another form of ego satisfaction. You help others because it makes you feel good, because it improves your self-image, because it earns you social approval. This isn't genuine compassion. It's ego wearing a compassionate mask. But when genuine compassion arises, even briefly, something shifts. And Schopenhauer suggested that cultivating the conditions for such experiences might be one of the few legitimate responses to the fundamental condition of suffering. Not cultivating willpower to achieve your goals, but cultivating the capacity to see through the illusion of separateness that makes those goals seem so important in the first place. As you settle deeper into rest, consider your relationship with others, not in the abstract, not as a moral principle, but actually. The people whose lives touch yours, their suffering is as real as your own. Their desires are as urgent to them as yours are to you. Their struggles with willpower and discipline and the feeling of never being enough, they're experiencing the same pattern you experience. The same will manifesting in different forms, creating the same basic structure of dissatisfaction. In recognizing this, in feeling it rather than just thinking it, something might loosen. The fierce urgency of your own self-improvement projects might ease, not because you've satisfied your ambitions, but because you've seen that they were never as cosmically important as they felt. You're one wave in an ocean of waves, and the wave doesn't need to be especially impressive. It just needs to be a wave. And in being just a wave, in recognizing its continuity with all the other waves and the water they're all made of, there might be a peace that personal achievement could never provide. There's another pathway Schopenhauer identified. Another way the will's grip can temporarily loosen. And this one is more surprising than compassion. It's through aesthetic experience, through art, through beauty. When you look at a beautiful sunset, or listen to music that moves you deeply, or stand before a painting that captivates your attention, something unusual happens. Time seems to stop. Your concerns fade. You're not thinking about your to-do list or your goals or your problems. You're absorbed in the experience itself, in the pure perception of form and color and sound. Schopenhauer saw this aesthetic absorption as profoundly significant. In ordinary consciousness, you're always relating everything to your interests. That mountain is in the way of where you want to go. That person is either useful or threatening or irrelevant to your goals. That food is something you want or don't want. Everything is filtered through the lens of will, of desire and aversion, as they relate to your survival and satisfaction. But in genuine aesthetic experience, this utilitarian perspective drops away. You're not looking at the sunset thinking about what it means for your evening plans. You're not listening to the music calculating how it affects your productivity. You're just experiencing pure perception without the overlay of personal interest. Schopenhauer called this state will-less perception. The will is still there, still operating at the level of keeping you alive and breathing, but its demands have gone quiet. You're not wanting anything in that moment. You're just experiencing, just perceiving. And there's a peace in that state that's completely different from the peace of satisfied desire. This is why art has such a profound effect on people. When a piece of music brings you to tears, it's not because the music satisfied some desire. It's because it temporarily released you from desire. When a painting captivates you, it's not because you wanted to see it, and now you have. It's because in the absorption of looking, the wanting itself stopped. The genius artist, according to Schopenhauer, is someone who can sustain this state longer than ordinary people. Most of us can only maintain aesthetic absorption for brief moments before our personal concerns reassert themselves, before we start thinking about dinner, or checking our phone, or worrying about tomorrow. But the artistic genius can sustain will-less perception for extended periods. And moreover, they can communicate what they perceive in that state through their art. This is why great art feels universal even when it's depicting something specific. The artist has perceived the essence of something, not filtered through personal interest, but as pure form, pure idea. And when you encounter their work, you can briefly share that perception, can see through their eyes for a moment, and experience that same liberation from will. Music, Schopenhauer thought, was special among the arts. While painting or sculpture or poetry represent ideas, eternal forms that exist beyond individual things, music directly represents the will itself, not in its manifestation as this or that particular desire, but in its fundamental structure of tension and resolution, longing and satisfaction, the basic pattern that underlies all willing. This is why music can move us so deeply even when we have no idea what it means. It's not representing anything in the world of objects and events. It's representing the structure of willing itself, and we recognize ourselves in that structure. We hear our own nature reflected back to us, but transformed, made into something beautiful rather than something painful. The suffering inherent in willing is still there in the music. You can hear it in the dissonances and tensions, but it's presented in a form that allows appreciation rather than aversion. Now, how does this relate to your struggles with discipline and willpower? What does aesthetic experience have to do with your morning routine or your diet? The connection is that aesthetic experience shows there's an alternative to the constant striving that characterizes both undisciplined and disciplined life. The undisciplined person is driven by immediate desires. The disciplined person is driven by long-term goals, but both are driven. Both are caught in the cycle of wanting, striving, brief satisfaction, renewed wanting. Neither is at peace. But in aesthetic absorption, you're temporarily released from that cycle. You're not achieving anything. You're not making progress toward goals. You're not satisfying desires. You're just perceiving, just experiencing, and there's a completeness to the experience that has nothing to do with accomplishment. This suggests a different relationship with discipline and productivity. What if you built into your life regular time for experiences that have no productive purpose? Not as a way to recharge so you can be more productive later, not as a strategy for better performance, but as valuable in themselves precisely because they're not productive. The modern productivity mindset sees everything as either useful or wasteful. Time spent on activities that don't advance your goals is time wasted. But Schopenhauer would say that time spent in aesthetic absorption is among the most valuable time possible, because it's time when you're not enslaved to the will, not driven by desire, not suffering the fundamental dissatisfaction of never having enough or being enough. Going to a museum, listening to music deeply rather than as background, watching a sunset without documenting it for social media, reading poetry for its own sake rather than to extract lessons or insights. These aren't frivolous activities. They're some of the few genuine respites from the will's relentless demanding. But here's the paradox. You can't turn aesthetic experience into a productivity technique. The moment you approach art thinking, this will make me calmer so I can work better, you've missed the point. You're still caught in the utilitarian framework, still relating everything to your goals and purposes. Genuine aesthetic experience requires letting go of purpose, letting go of goals, just being present with the experience for its own sake. This is incredibly difficult for modern people trained to optimize everything, to justify every minute, to always be moving towards something. We've lost the ability to simply experience without immediately asking what it's for, how it helps us, what we're going to do with it. Even our leisure is productive. We consume entertainment, we don't savor it. We scroll through images instead of really looking at any of them. We listen to podcasts at double speed to get through more content. We're so driven by the will to get more, experience more, achieve more, that we've forgotten how to just stop and perceive. Schopenhauer suggested that making space for genuine aesthetic experience is one of the few legitimate responses to the suffering inherent in existence, not as a technique, not as a strategy, but as an end in itself. The moments when you're absorbed in beauty are moments of liberation, brief pauses in the endless cycle of desire and frustration. And here's something interesting. These moments often happen spontaneously, when you're not seeking them. You're walking somewhere with no particular purpose, and suddenly you notice how the light falls through trees and you stop, captured by the beauty of it. You're driving, and a song comes on that moves you so deeply you have to pull over. You're in a gallery, and one painting among dozens arrests your attention and holds it completely. These moments can't be forced. You can create conditions that make them more likely. Expose yourself to art and nature and music, but you can't make them happen through an effort of will, which is fitting because they're precisely moments when the will goes quiet. Trying to force them is like trying to force yourself to sleep. The effort itself prevents the very thing you're seeking. As you drift now, maybe you can feel something similar. The release of purpose, the letting go of goals, the simple resting in experience without needing it to be different or to lead anywhere. Sleep itself is a kind of will-less state. You're not trying to accomplish anything. You're not working toward anything. You're just letting consciousness dissolve into rest. This is what aesthetic experience offers in waking life. Small deaths of the ego, brief dissolutions of the sense that you're a separate self pursuing separate purposes, and in those dissolutions, a peace that has nothing to do with achievement or discipline or willpower. A peace that comes from temporarily ceasing to want anything at all. Finally, we come to Schopenhauer's most radical proposal, the ultimate escape from the will's domination. Asceticism, the complete denial of the will to live through systematic renunciation of all desires, all pleasures, all attachments. This is the path of the saint, the monk, the hermit, who withdraws from the world to practice extreme self-denial. No sex, no rich food, minimal comfort, no ambition, no pursuit of pleasure or status or achievement. A life stripped down to bare survival, and sometimes not even that. The ultimate ascetic, in Schopenhauer's vision, would welcome death as the final release from willing. Schopenhauer drew this idea primarily from his study of Buddhism and Hindu ascetic traditions. He saw in the Buddhist monk's life of renunciation and meditation a practical application of his own philosophical insights. The Buddha's teaching that desire causes suffering and that the path to liberation lies in extinguishing desire perfectly matched Schopenhauer's analysis. The Hindu sadhu who renounces worldly life to focus entirely on spiritual practice was doing exactly what Schopenhauer's philosophy suggested was necessary for escape from suffering. In Christian tradition, he saw echoes of the same insight. The Desert Fathers, medieval monks and nuns practicing extreme asceticism, mystics who described the soul's need to die to itself to find union with God, all were expressing in religious terms what Schopenhauer articulated philosophically. The will must be denied, negated, refused, until finally its grip weakens enough for genuine peace. But here's the uncomfortable truth about Schopenhauer's ascetic solution. It's completely impractical for almost everyone, and Schopenhauer knew it. He himself never lived as an ascetic. He enjoyed fine food, lived comfortably on his inheritance, went to the opera, read novels. He appreciated beauty and pleasure. He was describing a theoretical endpoint, a logical conclusion of his philosophy, not offering practical advice for how to live. He acknowledged that most people, including himself, lacked either the inclination or the capacity for genuine asceticism. The will is too strong in most of us. Our desires are too insistent. The drive to seek pleasure and avoid pain is too fundamental to be simply overcome by understanding or resolution. Moreover, there's something paradoxical about choosing asceticism. If you choose to deny the will, isn't the choice itself an expression of will? If you want to escape desire, isn't that wanting also a desire? The very effort to practice asceticism seems to arise from the will, perhaps in a particularly sophisticated form, the desire to end desire. How can the will deny itself using itself? Schopenhauer wrestled with this paradox. His answer was that genuine denial of the will couldn't come from decision or effort. It had to arise spontaneously, as a kind of grace, a transformation of consciousness that happened to a person rather than being chosen by them. The person who becomes a genuine ascetic doesn't decide to renounce the world. They undergo an experience, often of profound suffering or insight, that fundamentally changes how they relate to existence. After that change, Renunciation isn't a discipline they maintain through willpower. It's a natural expression of their transformed state. But this makes asceticism even less useful as practical advice. You can't follow a path to this transformation. It either happens to you or it doesn't. All you can do is create conditions that might make it more likely. Expose yourself to suffering and truth and beauty in ways that might crack the ego's shell. But there's no technique, no method, no 7-step program to ascetic enlightenment. So what's the relevance of this to your struggles with willpower and discipline? Why spend time on a solution that Schopenhauer himself admitted was impractical for most people? Because it clarifies the stakes. It shows what would actually be required to escape the cycle of desire and suffering that manifests in your morning alarm battles, your diet struggles, your productivity anxiety, complete renunciation, total denial of the will, not better discipline, not more effective techniques, not optimized systems, the complete opposite, giving up entirely on the project of achieving satisfaction through striving. This puts your more modest struggles in perspective. When you fail to stick with your exercise routine, you're not falling short of some achievable standard. You're failing to do something that would require a complete transformation of your fundamental nature, a transformation that even Schopenhauer admitted he hadn't achieved. The disciplined life the productivity influencers promise is impossible because it's still within the framework of willing, and willing itself is the problem. But there's something else here too, something that might be more practically useful. While complete asceticism might be impossible, and perhaps not even desirable for most people, the insight behind it has applications. The insight is that satisfaction comes not from achieving your desires, but from reducing the intensity of your desires themselves. You can't completely deny the will, but you might be able to live in a way that doesn't constantly inflame it. This doesn't mean becoming an ascetic monk. It means questioning the cultural messages that tell you to want more, be more, achieve more. It means perhaps living more simply not as a spiritual practice, but as a practical way to reduce the number of desires demanding satisfaction. It means distinguishing between needs and wants, between genuine values and culturally imposed ambitions. Modern minimalism is a diluted, consumerist-friendly version of this insight. People discover that owning fewer things creates a kind of peace, not because the things themselves were the problem, but because each possession represents a desire, a concern, a potential source of dissatisfaction. Fewer possessions means fewer attachments, less to maintain and worry about and protect. The minimalist isn't practicing asceticism, but they're touching the edge of the same insight. Less wanting means less suffering. Similarly, people who step back from social media often report feeling lighter, less anxious, more content. This isn't just because they're spending less time on screens. It's because social media is a desire generation machine. Every scroll shows you something someone has that you don't. Someone doing what you're not doing. Someone being what you're not being. It creates artificial desires constantly. Stepping back from that stream doesn't make you ascetic, but it does reduce the volume of wanting you're exposed to. The person who opts out of the constant upgrade cycle, who keeps their phone until it breaks rather than getting the newest model, who doesn't need the latest fashion or the biggest house or the most impressive vacation, isn't denying the will completely, but they're not feeding it as actively. They're not constantly creating new forms of desire for it to manifest through. This is far from Schopenhauer's ultimate vision of complete renunciation. But it's perhaps a practical response to the insight that less wanting means less suffering. You can't stop wanting entirely while remaining alive, but you can stop deliberately cultivating new desires. Stop exposing yourself to the constant messages that you need more and should be more and could have more if you just tried harder. In this sense, the alternative to the productivity and discipline culture isn't becoming a monk. It's just stopping. Stopping the constant self-improvement project. Stopping the comparison with others. Stopping the consumption of content designed to make you feel inadequate. Stopping the belief that your value depends on your achievements. Not as a new discipline to practice, but as a simple cessation of something that was always exhausting. The irony is that this kind of stopping might actually make certain kinds of discipline easier. When you're not constantly inflaming the will with new desires, when you're not always measuring yourself against impossible standards, the basic requirements of life become less burdensome. You still need to work, care for yourself, maintain relationships, but these things become lighter when they're not freighted with the meaning of proving your worth or achieving your potential or becoming someone impressive. As sleep overtakes you now, consider what it would mean to stop, not to achieve or accomplish or transcend, but to simply stop adding fuel to the fire of desire, to let your life be what it is without the constant effort to make it something more. This isn't asceticism, it's just rest. And maybe, in our culture of relentless striving, rest itself is radical enough. So we've explored Schopenhauer's dark philosophy, the will as blind force beneath reality, the illusion of control, the cycle of suffering, the futility of striving, the temporary respites of compassion and aesthetic experience, the impractical ultimate solution of ascetic renunciation. Where does this leave us? What practical wisdom can we extract from such a grim vision? First, accept what you are. This is fundamental. You're not a project to be optimized. You're not a potential to be realized. You're a manifestation of the will, configured in a particular way by genetics and experience and circumstances you didn't choose. This configuration has strengths and limitations that are largely fixed. Fighting against your fundamental nature is exhausting and ultimately futile. This doesn't mean giving up on everything. It means working with what you are rather than constantly trying to be something you're not. If you're not a morning person, structure your life around that instead of fighting it every day. If certain activities energize you and others drain you, arrange things to emphasize the former. If you have natural strengths in certain areas and persistent weaknesses in others, build your life to utilize strengths rather than constantly trying to fix weaknesses. The productivity culture tells you that you can become anything through enough discipline and effort. Schopenhauer would say this is false and harmful. You can become a better version of what you already are. You can develop skills and build on strengths, but you can't fundamentally alter your nature through willpower. The anxious person can learn coping strategies, but probably can't will themselves into being naturally calm. The introverted person can learn social skills, but probably can't force themselves to become genuinely extroverted. Accepting these limitations isn't failure, it's wisdom. Second, distinguish between discipline and self-violence. There's a difference between working with your nature to develop good habits and waging war against yourself to force compliance with external standards. The first might lead to sustainable improvements. The second leads to exhaustion and eventual collapse. When you're practicing genuine discipline, it feels challenging but not torturous. There's resistance, but you can feel yourself gradually adapting, getting stronger, developing capacity. When you're practicing self-violence, it feels like constant battle. You're forcing yourself against your nature, and the effort never gets easier because you're fighting who you fundamentally are. Modern productivity culture often encourages self-violence disguised as discipline. Wake up at 5, even though everything in your body protests. Push through exhaustion to hit your goals. Overcome your weakness. Dominate yourself. This language of domination and force suggests violence, not development. Schopenhauer would say that this approach is the will in conflict with itself, using your consciousness as the battlefield. One part of the will manifesting as ambition or shame or cultural conditioning, trying to dominate another part, your natural inclinations and limitations. Neither side can win permanently because both are expressions of the same underlying force. But the battle itself is exhausting. Better to accept your nature and work with it. If you're naturally inclined to procrastinate, build structures that make procrastination harder. If you're naturally drawn to distraction, remove distractions from your environment. If you lack willpower for certain activities, arrange your life to require less willpower rather than trying to develop more. Third, understand the limits of achievement. Goals are useful for directing effort, but achieving them won't provide the satisfaction you imagine. The relief is temporary. New desires arise. The hedonic treadmill continues. Knowing this in advance changes how you relate to your goals. You might still pursue them, but with less emotional investment in the outcome. You do what you do not because achievement will finally make you happy, but because doing something is better than doing nothing. Because the process itself can be engaging even if the outcome is ultimately hollow. Because you're going to be driven by the will anyway, so you might as well direct it toward something. This is very different from the fevered ambition that characterizes productivity culture. That ambition is based on the false promise that achievement will satisfy. The person caught in that framework invests everything in their goals, believing that reaching them will prove their worth, and finally allow them to rest. Then they achieve the goals and discover the rest never comes. There's only the next goal, the next challenge, the next way they're falling short. Understanding Schopenhauer immunizes you against this disappointment, not by making you give up on goals, but by making you hold them more lightly. You pursue what interests you, what engages you, what seems worth doing, but you don't stake your happiness or your identity on the outcomes. The outcomes are going to be empty anyway. What matters, if anything matters, is the quality of the process itself. Fourth, cultivate compassion, not as a moral obligation, not to be a good person, but as a practical way to reduce the suffering caused by ego-centered desire. When you're genuinely concerned with others' welfare, your own achievements seem less critical. Your own struggles with discipline seem less devastating. The entire drama of self-improvement loses some of its urgency. This doesn't mean neglecting yourself or martyring yourself for others. It means expanding your sphere of concern beyond the narrow circle of your own ambitions. It means recognizing that everyone is struggling with the same fundamental condition you're struggling with, driven by desires they didn't choose, failing at impossible demands, trying to find satisfaction in a structure that can't provide it. When you see your own struggles in everyone else's struggles, judgment softens. You become more patient with others' failings because you recognize them as your own. And in that recognition, in that compassion, some of the ego's sharp edges wear away. You're not as invested in being impressive or successful or disciplined because you see that everyone's in the same boat, and the boat is sinking anyway. Might as well be kind to your fellow passengers while it goes down. Fifth, make space for beauty and aesthetic experience, not as productivity techniques, not as ways to recharge for more work, but as ends in themselves. Time spent absorbed in music or art or nature is time when the will's demands quiet. These moments are valuable precisely because they have no practical value, because they serve no purpose beyond themselves. Build into your life regular exposure to things that can capture your attention in this way. Maybe it's walks in natural settings. Maybe it's museums or concerts. Maybe it's reading poetry or watching sunsets or listening to music with your full attention, rather than as background. Whatever provides those moments when time stops and you forget to want anything and you're just experiencing. These moments won't solve your problems. They won't give you more discipline or make your goals easier to achieve, but they provide temporary respite from the fundamental condition of being driven by desire. And in a life characterized by that condition, respite is valuable even if it's temporary. Sixth, question the narratives. The productivity culture, the self-help industry, the influencers and gurus and life coaches, they all tell a story. You're in control. You can achieve anything. Success is just a matter of discipline and consistency. Your struggles are personal failings that can be overcome with the right techniques and enough willpower. Schopenhauer's philosophy is an antidote to these narratives. It says, no, you're not in control. You can't achieve anything. Success won't satisfy you. Your struggles aren't personal failings, but expressions of the human condition. And there's no technique or system that will solve the fundamental problem, because the problem isn't that you're doing something wrong. The problem is that you're alive. This sounds depressing, but it's actually liberating. When you stop believing the false narratives, you stop blaming yourself for failing to achieve impossible standards. When you stop believing that satisfaction comes from achievement, you stop investing so much in outcomes that inevitably disappoint. When you stop believing in your own total control, you stop exhausting yourself trying to exercise it. The modern self-improvement culture creates a particular form of suffering, the suffering of constant self-judgment, constant measurement against ideals you can never reach, constant guilt for falling short. Schopenhauer's pessimism, paradoxically, relieves that suffering, not by solving the fundamental problem of existence, but by showing that there is no solution, that the problem is structural, that you're not personally failing at something everyone else is succeeding at. Everyone's failing because the game is rigged. That's actually good news. Seventh, learn when to stop fighting. The disciplined life promises control, but real wisdom includes knowing when to let go. Sometimes the right response isn't more effort, but acceptance. Sometimes the thing to do isn't to try harder, but to stop trying. This is especially relevant to sleep, which is why it's fitting we're discussing it. As you drift off, you can't force yourself to sleep. You can only create conditions and then surrender. The harder you try to make yourself sleep, the more sleep eludes you. You have to stop trying, stop controlling, stop willing, and allow it to happen. What if that's true for more of life than we acknowledge? What if many of the things we struggle with resist our efforts precisely because we're trying too hard? What if the solution isn't better techniques but letting go? This doesn't mean never trying, never making effort, never pursuing goals. But it means recognizing that effort has limits, that control is partial, that sometimes the wisest response is to stop. Stop fighting your nature. Stop trying to be someone you're not. Stop measuring yourself against impossible standards. Stop believing that one more technique, one more system, one more burst of discipline will finally solve the problem. The problem won't be solved. The will doesn't stop. Desire doesn't end. Suffering is inherent in existence, but suffering can be reduced by stopping the additional suffering we create through our resistance to the fundamental condition. The pain of wanting is inevitable. The pain of believing we shouldn't want, of judging ourselves for wanting, of exhausting ourselves trying to control the wanting. This pain is optional. We create it through our resistance to what is. Finally, find peace in recognition. Not the peace of achievement or satisfaction or solved problems. The peace that comes from seeing clearly, seeing that you're not in control and never were, seeing that the will drives everything and you're just along for the ride, seeing that everyone else is in the same situation, flailing in the same way, suffering from the same fundamental condition. There's a strange peace in this recognition. Not the peace of happiness, but the peace of truth. When you stop believing false promises, you stop being disappointed when they aren't kept. When you stop believing you should be able to control everything, you stop exhausting yourself trying. When you stop believing achievement will satisfy, you stop investing so much in outcomes. This is what Schopenhauer offers, not hope, not solutions, not techniques for success, just clarity about what we are and what we can reasonably expect from existence. And in that clarity, paradoxically, something like peace becomes possible. Not the peace of satisfied desire, the peace of recognized futility, which sounds grim, but might actually be the only kind of peace available to creatures like us, driven by forces we can't control toward satisfactions that never satisfy. The great irony is that Schopenhauer's philosophy, which seems so dark and pessimistic, might be more realistic and ultimately more helpful than the optimistic fantasies of the self-help industry. Because it doesn't promise what it can't deliver. It doesn't set you up for disappointment. It tells you the truth as Schopenhauer saw it, even though the truth is uncomfortable. And maybe, just maybe, knowing the truth is better than believing comforting lies. Maybe understanding that you're not failing at being human, but simply experiencing what being human entails is actually a relief. Maybe recognizing that the struggle isn't personal, that everyone's struggling with the same fundamental condition, creates a kind of solidarity that's more valuable than individual achievement. Maybe the point isn't to win the battle with the will, which is impossible. Maybe the point is to see the battle for what it is, to recognize the forces at play, to stop taking it all so personally and seriously, to be able to watch yourself being driven by desire and frustration, to see the will manifesting in your own life and everyone else's, and to respond with compassion and humor rather than judgment and shame. To live well, according to Schopenhauer, might not mean living successfully in the world's terms. It might mean living with clear eyes, seeing the comedy and tragedy of existence, recognizing your own participation in the endless cycle of striving and suffering, and somehow finding in that recognition a kind of peace that transcends both success and failure. So if you wake tomorrow and hit the snooze button, if you don't follow your morning routine, if you eat the thing you said you wouldn't eat, or skip the workout you planned, or waste the evening scrolling when you meant to be productive, maybe you can do so without the crushing guilt. Not because these behaviors don't matter, but because they're just manifestations of the will doing what the will does. You're not failing at a test you should be able to pass. You're experiencing the human condition in its purest form. And if that recognition doesn't give you more discipline, well, that's also the will doing what it does. Schopenhauer would understand. He'd probably just return to his poodle and his routine and his philosophy, neither judging you nor particularly caring, because he knew that everyone's caught in the same trap, and there's no moral superiority in recognizing the trap versus being caught in it unknowingly. Recognition doesn't free you from the trap. It just makes the trap visible. But visible traps are better than invisible ones. At least you know what you're dealing with. At least you're not surprised when you can't escape. At least you can stop blaming yourself for being exactly what you are, a manifestation of the will, driven by forces beyond your control, striving towards satisfactions that won't satisfy, failing at impossible demands, and somehow, in the midst of all that, still capable of moments of beauty and compassion and insight. Brief respites from the endless wanting, small victories that aren't victories at all, but just pauses in the inevitable cycle. Valuable not because they solve anything, but because they provide temporary relief from the condition of being alive. And now, as sleep finally takes you, as consciousness dissolves and the will continues its work beneath awareness, keeping your heart beating and lungs breathing and body functioning, you can rest knowing that you are not your discipline or lack of discipline, not your achievements or failures, not your willpower or weakness. You are something deeper and stranger and more fundamental, something that existed before you were conscious and will continue after consciousness fades. You are the will briefly knowing itself, briefly experiencing its own nature, briefly suffering its own insatiability. And in the morning, you'll wake up and do it all again. Because that's what the will does. It continues, it persists, it strives without end. Unless you hit the snooze button, which you probably will. And that's okay. Schopenhauer would understand. He hit his own version of the snooze button for decades, living comfortably while writing about ascetic denial, knowing the truth while being too attached to comfort to fully live it. He was human too, driven by the same will, caught in the same contradictions, talking about escape while never quite managing it himself. Maybe that's the real message. Not that you should become something you're not, but that you should accept what you are. Not that discipline will save you, but that nothing will save you. And that's actually okay. Not that you should try harder, but that trying itself might be part of the problem. Not that you're failing, but that failure is the default state and success is the temporary illusion. Not that you should be different, but that you can't be, fundamentally, and recognizing that is its own kind of freedom. Sleep well. Tomorrow the struggle continues. The will doesn't stop. Desires arise. Goals call out. The morning alarm will ring, and you'll respond however you respond. Another expression of the eternal force manifesting through your particular form, doing what it does because it can do nothing else, wanting because that's its nature, and maybe, just maybe, understanding a little better why you're struggling in the first place. That understanding won't make you more disciplined, but it might make you more compassionate toward yourself and others. And in a world of endless striving and universal suffering, compassion might be worth more than discipline ever was. Not because it solves anything, but because it acknowledges the truth. We're all in this together. None of us chose it. None of us can escape it. But we can see each other in our shared predicament and respond with kindness instead of judgment. And if that's not wisdom, it's at least a start. Thank you for joining me in this exploration of Schopenhauer's uncomfortable truths. If you found some resonance in these ideas, some recognition of your own experience in this dark philosophy, please like this video and subscribe to the channel. Not because it will satisfy some deep need or solve your problems, but because sometimes it helps to know you're not alone in the struggle. Sometimes it helps to hear these truths spoken, even if they don't change anything. Even if tomorrow brings the same challenges and the same failures and the same exhausting cycle of wanting and frustration. And as you drift into sleep now, let go of the need to be disciplined, productive, successful. Let go of the struggle with yourself. Let go of the whole impossible project of controlling what can't be controlled. Rest in the knowledge that you are exactly what you are, driven by forces beyond your choosing. And that's enough. Not glorious, not impressive, not worthy of admiration or envy. Just enough. Just what is. Just the will manifesting in one more temporary form, experiencing itself, suffering itself, And somehow, in the midst of that suffering, finding moments of beauty and connection and understanding that make the whole strange journey almost bearable. Good night.